In the bustling courtroom of Millwood County Judge Thomas Callahan sat behind his worn desk reviewing case files as the day's docket continued to unfold. The sun streamed in through tall windows, casting light across the wooden benches and cold marble floors, each case a small yet intricate story of the lives that passed through his hands today. It was Olivia Williams' turn to stand before him. Olivia, a woman in her early 30s, walked into the courtroom with a calm confidence that few others possessed. She was dressed neatly in a dark tailored suit, her posture straight. As she approached the podium, she glanced around the room. Quickly, her expression unreadable, but steady. The case was simple: a speeding ticket. She had been caught driving 15 miles over the speed limit in a school zone and had been cited by an officer who had been patrolling the area. Olivia didn't flinch when the charges were read aloud. Instead, she calmly addressed the court, stating that she had been rushing to her mother's home as she had received a call that her mother wasn't feeling well. She had been unable to stop and speak to the officer as she had been focused on reaching her mother's side in time for assistance. She offered a sincere apology for her actions and explained that she was usually cautious when driving but had made a poor decision under pressure. Judge Callahan listened carefully, his gaze steady as Olivia spoke. He had seen dozens of defendants make excuses over the years, often pleading for leniency, but there was something about Olivia's delivery that seemed different. Yet still he remained cautious. She was composed, maybe too composed for someone in her position. After all, why was she so calm? Was she hiding something? Or did she simply believe that her status would shield her from any real consequences? Without hesitation, Judge Callahan spoke up in his usual firm tone. He informed Olivia that while he understood her explanation, the law was clear and the safety of children near schools was paramount. The fine for the offense would be applied. He also reminded her that speeding in school zones was not something to take lightly. He warned her to be more careful in the future. As the fine was being issued, she simply nodded politely, not showing any signs of frustration or anger. Her voice never rose in protest, nor did she appear the least bit shaken by the judgment. In fact, she almost seemed resigned to it. She thanked the judge in a soft tone and moved to leave the courtroom without any further comment. Judge Callahan watched her as she walked away. There was something about her demeanor that lingered with him. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the way she carried herself suggested a depth he hadn't expected from a defendant in a traffic case. Something about her suggested she wasn't just an ordinary person. This wasn't the first time he'd seen someone handle a case like this with such poise. But there was an undercurrent of something more significant, a quiet power perhaps, or perhaps a certain restraint that seemed almost deliberate. As she exited the courtroom, he sat back in his chair, momentarily distracted by the strange feeling that had settled in the pit of his stomach, not knowing that this brief encounter would soon become something that would change everything for both of them. Later that day, Judge Thomas Callahan sat in his chambers, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee as his clerk, Nathan, shuffled through the pile of case files on his desk. The courthouse was quieter now, the afternoon sunlight fading into the dimming glow of late afternoon. The hum of distant voices echoed from the halls, but the weight of the morning's cases still lingered in Callahan's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Olivia Williams. Nathan, eager to move on to the next task, mentioned casually that he had heard a few things about Olivia. He had noticed her name in the local paper recently and had heard rumblings from a few lawyers about the rise of a new district attorney. Callahan raised an eyebrow and set his coffee down, his attention now fully on the conversation. Nathan went on to explain that Olivia wasn't just any lawyer. She had recently been appointed district attorney, a position that made her one of the most powerful figures in the county's legal system. Callahan paused, taking in the information. His mind raced. Asterisk, asterisk, the district attorney, asterisk, asterisk. He recalled her calm composure in court now through a different lens. He hadn't made the connection during the trial, but now that Nathan mentioned it, he realized the name Olivia Williams was familiar from news reports and legal circles. She wasn't just some random defendant trying to wriggle out of a speeding ticket. She was the face of law and order in the county, the very person who held the power to influence major legal decisions and reform. Nathan continued, oblivious to the judge's growing discomfort. He mentioned that Olivia had been praised for her efforts in criminal justice reform, particularly for advocating for less punitive measures on non-violent offenders. She had made quite an impression with her progressive stances. The more Nathan spoke, the more Callahan felt his stomach churn. He couldn't help but feel foolish for not recognizing her earlier. Had he truly just fined the district attorney for a speeding violation without any hesitation? His unease grew as he reflected on his decision earlier that morning. Olivia's story about rushing to her mother's side, was it simply a convenient excuse, or had she been genuinely sincere? She had been calm, composed, even deferential in a way that didn't seem to match the usual defensive posturing he encountered in his courtroom. Callahan had dismissed it all too quickly, hadn't he? He hadn't even stopped to consider who she was or the potential ramifications of his actions. It wasn't just the fine that bothered him. It was the judgment he had made in an instant without thought, based purely on the superficial details of the case. In hindsight, it seemed rash, and the fact that he hadn't noticed her status left him feeling embarrassed. He excused Nathan and sank into his chair, his mind working overtime. The image of Olivia, her quiet confidence, her graceful response, kept playing over and over. Asterisk, asterisk, what had he missed? Asterisk, asterisk. After a few moments of silence, he made up his mind. He had to find out more. The weight of his decision rested heavily on him, and something told him that the encounter wasn't as simple as a courtroom misstep. Olivia Williams was more than just a defendant, and Callahan needed to understand just who she was before things spiraled further. Judge Thomas Callahan spent the remainder of the afternoon in a haze, the looming realization of his mistake consuming his thoughts. The more he thought about it, the more uncomfortable he became. The discovery that Olivia Williams was the new district attorney of Millwood County left him feeling unsettled, almost ashamed. How had he missed it? A powerful woman, respected in legal circles, standing before him, and he treated her as just another speeding violator. Unable to focus on anything else, Callahan decided to take matters into his own hands. He spent the next few hours in his office, poring over public records and any available information on Olivia. He opened her biography online, reading about her rise in the legal world, how she had worked tirelessly through law school, been a top prosecutor for years, and had been handpicked for the district attorney's position due to her skill, dedication, and reform-minded approach to criminal justice. As he read, the weight of his mistake deepened. Olivia had been in the public eye for months, and it wasn't as if her accomplishments were hidden. She had given speeches on criminal reform, been interviewed about her approach to fairness in sentencing, and had even appeared on local news. The more Callahan read, the more he realized how much he had missed. She wasn't just a high-ranking legal professional. She was an advocate for justice, working against the very biases that had clouded his judgment earlier that day. It wasn't just the fine that bothered him anymore. It was his entire approach to her. The assumption he had made about her being just another defendant, her calm demeanor dismissed as lack of passion or care. If he had known who she was, would he have made the same decision? Would he have treated her differently? It was becoming painfully clear that he had let unconscious biases guide him, and now the consequences were much greater than he'd imagined. But what bothered him the most was how easy it had been to make that assumption. Callahan had prided himself on being an objective judge, someone who looked at the facts and delivered fair rulings. Yet here he was, realizing that his judgment had been clouded not by the facts, but by ingrained prejudices about who was deserving of leniency and who wasn't. As the evening drew on, Callahan found himself pacing his office, considering what to do next. He couldn't undo the fine. The court's decision had been made, and the paperwork had already been filed. But there was something he could do. He could reach out to Olivia. He could apologize. The thought of confronting her, admitting his mistake, and acknowledging his biases made him uneasy, but he knew it was the right thing to do. He spent the next few hours drafting an email to Olivia. It wasn't an apology in the traditional sense. It was more of a recognition of his mistake and a request for a conversation. He wanted to meet with her, to explain himself, and perhaps learn from her perspective. He hit send, a knot forming in his stomach as he did. He wasn't sure how she would react, but he knew that reaching out was the first step toward making things right. After sending the email, Callahan sat back in his chair, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. He had taken the first step toward owning his mistake, but he knew that the hard part was still to come, facing Olivia, understanding her point of view, and finding a way to move forward. The next morning, Judge Thomas Callahan was pacing his office again, waiting for a response to his email. He'd spent the whole night thinking about what he had written to Olivia Williams. The message was brief, direct, and humble. He had acknowledged his mistake in passing judgment without recognizing her role in the community and asked to meet with her to discuss it further. Despite his attempts to stay calm, he couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. What would she think of him? At 10:15 a.m., a reply pinged in his inbox. It was short but professional. Judge Callahan, I appreciate your message. I would be willing to meet with you. How about noon today? Let me know if that works for you. Relief washed over him as he read the email, but it was quickly followed by nervousness. He had a chance to apologize, to make it right. But what would this conversation hold? What if Olivia didn't want to engage, or worse, if she found his apology insincere? His palms grew clammy as he prepared for the meeting. At noon sharp, Olivia Williams entered his office. She was dressed in a simple yet elegant blazer, her posture as poised as it had been in the courtroom. There was no visible sign of anger or resentment, which surprised Callahan. He had expected to face a more defensive or frustrated version of Olivia, but instead, she walked in with the same calm confidence she had exhibited the day before. Judge Callahan, she said, offering a polite handshake. Thank you for reaching out. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, he replied, gesturing for her to sit. His voice was steadier than he felt, though the weight of the situation was thick in the air between them. Olivia sat down and gave him a polite, but careful smile. She was waiting for him to speak, so Callahan took a deep breath. He could feel the tension in his chest as he began to speak. I'll get straight to the point. Yesterday, I made a mistake. A significant one. When you appeared before me in court, I failed to recognize who you were, and in doing so, I misjudged you. I made assumptions based on your demeanor, your appearance, and I'm deeply sorry for that. He paused, watching her expression closely, but Olivia said nothing. She simply listened, her eyes steady. Callahan continued, his voice tinged with guilt. I allowed unconscious bias to influence my decision. It wasn't about the facts of the case, it was about my own prejudices. And that's not something I'm proud of. You're not just a defendant, Ms. Williams. You're the district attorney, someone who's been working to reform this system, someone who fights every day for fairness and justice. I failed to recognize that in the moment, and I regret it. Olivia finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. I appreciate your honesty, Judge Callahan. It's rare for someone in your position to admit their mistakes, especially when it comes to something as ingrained as bias. But I think it's important to understand that this is not just about me. It's about the system. It's about the fact that many people are treated differently based on how they look, how they present themselves, or where they come from. Callahan nodded, feeling the weight of her words. I understand that now, he said quietly. But I didn't in that moment, and I can't undo the decision, but I wanted to at least offer my apology. I know that words alone don't change anything. Olivia considered him for a moment, her gaze unwavering. No, they don't, she agreed. But they can be a starting point, and I'm willing to consider that. It's easy to assume, to act on preconceived notions, especially when we're comfortable in our positions. But you've acknowledged it, and that's more than most would do. There was a long pause before she continued. I want to be clear, though, this isn't just about you or me. It's about the work we do. If you truly want to make a difference in how the court system functions, if you want to leave a real legacy, you need to address these biases, not just in a personal sense, but systematically. And that's something we both have to work on. Callahan's heart sank a little at the weight of her words. This wasn't just an apology, it was a challenge. Olivia wasn't just letting him off the hook, she was holding him accountable in a way that felt both uncomfortable and empowering. He had come to her seeking redemption, but now it seemed as though she was asking him to do something bigger, something that would take time and effort, something he hadn't been prepared for. He looked at her, the realization settling in. "You're right," he said, his voice more determined now. "And I'm willing to help however I can. I want to learn to change how I operate in this system. Not just for you, but for the people who walk through these doors every day." Olivia nodded, a small smile breaking through her otherwise serious expression. "That's a good start, Judge Callahan," she said. "Let's see where we can go from here." And in that moment, Callahan knew this conversation marked a turning point, not just for him, but for the future of the justice system they both served. Over the next few weeks, Judge Thomas Callahan and Olivia Williams met several times to discuss the ways in which the legal system in Millwood County could be improved. What started as an apology and a recognition of Callahan's mistake grew into something more. Olivia had been candid from the beginning. She wanted more than just an admission of wrongdoing. She wanted a change in how the system operated, and she believed that Callahan, with his experience, could help lead that change. Their meetings were a blend of theory and practicality. Olivia would present ideas about reforming sentencing, reducing minor penalties, and addressing systemic racial biases within the system, while Callahan would provide insights from his years on the bench, outlining the challenges and resistance they would inevitably face. Callahan, who had once seen the law as something rigid and unchangeable, now began to see it as a living entity, one that could evolve, adapt, and improve. One morning, after a particularly intense discussion about over-policing in low-income neighborhoods, Olivia turned to Callahan, her expression serious. "I know you're trying, Judge, but the real challenge is going to be pushing for change in a system that's always been the same. It's going to take more than a few reforms. It's going to take a cultural shift." Callahan frowned, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent his entire career within the confines of the established system. Change, even if he agreed with it, had always felt like a distant goal, something that other people could fight for, not someone in his position. But as he looked across the table at Olivia, a woman who had already proven her willingness to push boundaries, he couldn't deny the sense of urgency in her voice. "What do you suggest?" he asked quietly. Olivia leaned back in her chair, her eyes sharp. "I think we need to start small, with practical reforms. If we can prove that fairness and justice aren't just ideals, but actionable goals, others will follow. It won't be easy, but it can be done. People like you, judges, lawyers, law enforcement, have to see the value in it, or nothing will change." Callahan mulled over her words. "I've always thought of fairness as something straightforward, something based on the law. But I've seen, through my own actions and through this conversation, how much bias can creep into those decisions." Olivia nodded, acknowledging his recognition. "Exactly. The law doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's a reflection of the people who create and enforce it. We need to address those biases head-on, even if they're uncomfortable. If we don't, we'll only keep perpetuating the same injustices." The conversation turned to specifics. They began drafting a proposal for a new community outreach program that would educate citizens on their rights, help them navigate legal systems, and offer support for those caught in the cycle of minor offenses. They also discussed revising sentencing guidelines for nonviolent crimes, aiming to reduce fines that disproportionately affected low-income individuals. But the most ambitious project they started was one that Callahan had initially resisted: an internal review of court decisions. Olivia had suggested implementing a system where judges could voluntarily review their past rulings, particularly in cases where there was a chance that bias had influenced their decisions. At first, Callahan had balked at the idea. How could he review his own past decisions without second-guessing his entire career? But Olivia had persisted, arguing that the only way forward was to be transparent and honest about past mistakes, and that doing so would set an example for others in the legal community. Slowly, Callahan's resistance softened. He began to see the value in confronting his past judgments head-on, and he agreed to take part in the review process. As their work progressed, Olivia and Callahan began to meet with other key figures in the community, police chiefs, local politicians, and other judges to discuss their reform initiatives. The initial reaction was mixed. Some were skeptical of their efforts, worried about the political fallout of challenging the status quo. Others were more receptive, eager to see what the future of the justice system could look like if they embraced change. Despite the challenges, Olivia and Callahan pressed on. For Callahan, the experience was eye-opening. He had spent years believing that his job was to enforce the law as it was written, without questioning its broader impact. But working alongside Olivia had shifted his perspective. Now he understood that the law wasn't just about rules. It was about people, their stories, and their struggles for justice. One afternoon, as they sat in his office, reviewing their progress, Callahan looked up at Olivia, a newfound respect in his eyes. "You were right," he said, the words feeling heavier than they had before. "I was too comfortable in my role. I never really questioned how the system worked until you made me see it differently." Olivia smiled, her eyes reflecting both satisfaction and the weight of the work still ahead. "We've got a long way to go, Judge, but at least now we're on the right path." And as they continued to work together, that path grew clearer. Each small step forward felt like a victory, and with every challenge they faced, Callahan's belief in the power of reform and fairness deepened. It wasn't just about changing the system, it was about changing themselves, and that was the first step towards something greater. As the weeks passed, Judge Callahan and Olivia Williams grew closer in their shared mission to reform the legal system. Their work together became a symbol of what could be achieved when unlikely allies united for a common cause. They met regularly, both refining their ideas and taking practical steps toward implementing their reform proposals. Despite the progress, they also faced constant opposition. Change, as they both quickly learned, wasn't easy, and those who had benefited from the status quo fought hard to keep it intact. One of the biggest challenges they encountered was convincing other judges to participate in the internal review of their past rulings. Many felt that such a process would undermine their authority, while others saw it as an unnecessary step toward acknowledging potential biases in their past decisions. Callahan, though uncomfortable at first, was becoming an advocate for the idea, but convincing his peers was another matter. One afternoon, Callahan and Olivia sat in his office, looking over a draft of their proposal that they planned to present at an upcoming judicial conference. "It's going to be a tough sell," Callahan admitted, running his hand through his hair. "The other judges are set in their ways. They won't want to acknowledge their past mistakes, especially not in front of the public." Olivia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I know, but the truth is, this is bigger than any individual judge's ego. We're talking about a systemic problem. If we don't start taking responsibility for our own biases, we'll never fix the system." Callahan's gaze was steady as he thought about the decades he'd spent on the bench, never truly questioning the fairness of his decisions until now. "I get that, but getting other judges to see it, that's going to take time. We have to start somewhere," Olivia said firmly. "You've already taken the first step, and that's more than most would do. Now, we need to make sure that others understand the importance of this. It's not just about changing their behavior. It's about showing them that accountability doesn't diminish their authority. It enhances it." Callahan wasn't sure if everyone would come around to that way of thinking, but Olivia's determination was contagious. He agreed that they needed to push forward, and the upcoming conference would be their first real opportunity to convince their colleagues that this process wasn't about change, but about growth. When the day of the judicial conference arrived, Callahan and Olivia stood together in front of a room filled with judges from across the county. The atmosphere was tense, and many of the judges looked wary, skeptical of what they were about to hear. Callahan had his doubts, too. Would they be able to convince their colleagues to adopt this new approach? Or would the old guard reject them outright? Olivia took the lead, as she often did, and addressed the room with the same calm authority that had earned her respect as district attorney. "Thank you for allowing us to present today. We're here not just to talk about theory, but to talk about something real, something that affects each and every one of us in this room. We're here to discuss accountability. And more specifically, we're here to discuss how we, as judges, can take responsibility for the decisions we've made in the past." She paused, scanning the room, watching the faces of her colleagues. Some looked uncomfortable, others intrigued, but all were listening. She continued, "This isn't about accusing anyone. This is about examining our past rulings with an eye toward fairness and acknowledging that, as humans, we're all subject to bias. Bias that can influence how we sentence, how we interpret the law, and how we make judgments that affect people's lives." There was a slight murmur in the room, and Callahan could feel the tension building. But Olivia didn't falter. She pressed on, outlining their proposal for an internal review process that would allow judges to voluntarily revisit cases where there was concern about bias or fairness. This is about transparency. It's about ensuring that the system we uphold is just, not just in theory, but in practice. We can't change the future if we're unwilling to confront the past. As Olivia finished her speech, Callahan stepped forward to speak. His voice was steady, but there was a sincerity in his tone that resonated with the room. "I've been on the bench for a long time, and I'll admit, I've never questioned my decisions the way I should have. But that's what this is about. Not being afraid to examine ourselves and our actions. I've made mistakes, and I'm asking for the chance to correct them. If we can do that, if we can hold ourselves accountable, then maybe we can start changing the way the system works for everyone." There was a long pause after Callahan finished speaking. The room was silent as the judges considered what had been said. Finally, one by one, a few of them began to speak up. Some voiced concerns about the practicality of the proposal, while others expressed their support for the idea, acknowledging that it was time to move forward. It wasn't a unanimous decision, but by the end of the conference, Callahan and Olivia had succeeded in planting the seed of change. The conversation had started, and that, they both knew, was the most important step. As they left the conference room together, Callahan turned to Olivia with a small smile. "We made progress today," he said, his voice a mix of relief and cautious optimism. Olivia smiled back, though her eyes remained focused on the work ahead. "We did. But this is just the beginning. There's a lot more to be done." And as they stepped into the hallway, ready for the next challenge, they knew that they were on the path to something bigger than both of them, something that could reshape the future of justice in Millwood County. In the weeks that followed the judicial conference, the momentum for reform began to build. Though it had been a slow start, with many judges hesitant to voluntarily participate in the review of past decisions, Callahan and Olivia had begun to see the fruits of their labor. A few of the more progressive judges had agreed to take part in the review process, and the more they shared their experiences, the more other judges were encouraged to reconsider their positions. However, the resistance was still strong among many, especially those who had held their positions for decades and viewed their authority as unquestionable. Olivia was never one to shy away from a challenge, but even she could feel the uphill battle ahead. She spent long hours in her office drafting new proposals, meeting with community leaders, and speaking at town halls, slowly building public support for the idea that a fairer justice system was not only necessary, but possible. She had worked on the reform from the ground up, understanding that if they didn't convince the people that the changes were in their best interest, it would be difficult to persuade the more entrenched members of the judicial system. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult town hall meeting, Olivia was feeling the weight of the task before her. She sat in the conference room of her office, her face tired but resolute. Callahan entered, looking as though he had just come from the courthouse. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, and it struck him just how much she had been carrying. "You okay?" he asked, taking a seat across from her. Olivia let out a breath and smiled faintly. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my plate. The town hall was rough. People are nervous about the changes we're proposing. They want justice, but they also want it to feel familiar and safe. The idea of overhauling the system, especially when it's been the same for so long, is a hard sell." Callahan nodded, understanding her frustration. "I get it. Change is scary, even for those who know it's necessary." "Exactly," Olivia said, her eyes dark with the weight of the challenge. "But we can't just focus on the judicial system alone. We need to bring the community with us. They need to understand why this matters, not just for them, but for everyone in this county." Callahan leaned forward, his face thoughtful. "We've done a lot of work with the judges, but maybe it's time we start involving the community in a more active way. What if we organized a series of listening sessions, like town halls, but where people can share their experiences with the justice system firsthand? Get them involved in the conversation. Olivia's eyes lit up as she considered the idea. That could work. If we give people the chance to speak real, personal stories, it could help them feel seen and heard. And maybe, just maybe, it could help shift the perspective of those still skeptical. It was a simple but powerful idea, and they quickly set to work. Over the next few weeks, they organized a series of community forums throughout Millwood County. They held sessions in schools, community centers, and even at local churches, places where people felt comfortable sharing their stories. The events were meant to give people a platform, but they also allowed Callahan and Olivia to hear directly from the community about their frustrations, fears, and hopes for a more just system. The first few forums were met with mixed reactions. Some citizens were hesitant to speak, unsure if anyone in power would actually listen. But slowly, as they heard one another's stories, the walls began to come down. People began to open up about how the system had failed them, about unfair sentences, about the feeling that the deck was stacked against them from the start. The stories were difficult to hear, but they were necessary. They humanized the issue, making it clear that the justice system wasn't just a set of laws, but something that affected real lives. At the last forum, held at a small community church on the outskirts of town, a young woman stood up. She was in her 20s, with a baby in her arms, and she spoke with raw honesty. "I got a speeding ticket last year. It was for a minor violation, but I couldn't afford the fine, so they tacked on fees, and before I knew it, I was facing jail time. I don't have the resources to pay. I just wanted to be able to keep my job and take care of my son. But instead, I was punished because I was poor." The room fell silent as her words hung in the air. Callahan felt a pang in his chest. This was what they had been working for, the real stories, the raw truth that exposed the flaws in the system they were trying to change. After the forum, Olivia turned to Callahan, her expression filled with determination. "This is why we're doing this. This is why the system has to change. These aren't just numbers and cases. These are people, and they deserve better." Callahan nodded, his conviction strengthened. "I hear you, and I'm with you every step of the way." The success of the community forums was a turning point. People began to rally behind Olivia and Callahan's efforts, and slowly, public support for reform grew. It was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, they could see a path forward, a path built on listening, understanding, and taking real action. The journey wasn't over, but they were no longer alone in it. The community was behind them, and together, they were stronger. In the weeks that followed the judicial conference, the momentum for reform began to build. Though it had been a slow start, with many judges hesitant to voluntarily participate in the review of past decisions, Callahan and Olivia had begun to see the fruits of their labor. A few of the more progressive judges had agreed to take part in the review process, and the more they shared their experiences, the more other judges were encouraged to reconsider their positions. However, the resistance was still strong among many, especially those who had held their positions for decades and viewed their authority as unquestionable. Olivia was never one to shy away from a challenge, but even she could feel the uphill battle ahead. She spent long hours in her office drafting new proposals, meeting with community leaders, and speaking at town halls, slowly building public support for the idea that a fairer justice system was not only necessary, but possible. She had worked on the reform from the ground up, understanding that if they didn't convince the people that the changes were in their best interest, it would be difficult to persuade the more entrenched members of the judicial system. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult town hall meeting, Olivia was feeling the weight of the task before her. She sat in the conference room of her office, her face tired but resolute. Callahan entered, looking as though he had just come from the courthouse. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, and it struck him just how much she had been carrying. "You okay?" he asked, taking a seat across from her. Olivia let out a breath and smiled faintly. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my plate." The town hall was rough. People are nervous about the changes we're proposing. They want justice, but they also want it to feel familiar and safe. The idea of overhauling the system, especially when it's been the same for so long, is a hard sell. Callahan nodded, understanding her frustration. I get it. Change is scary, even for those who know it's necessary. Exactly, Olivia said, her eyes dark with the weight of the challenge. But we can't just focus on the judicial system alone. We need to bring the community with us. They need to understand why this matters, not just for them, but for everyone in this county. Callahan leaned forward, his face thoughtful. We've done a lot of work with the judges, but maybe it's time we start involving the community in a more active way. What if we organize a series of listening sessions, like town halls, but where people can share their experiences with the justice system firsthand? Get them involved in the conversation. Olivia's eyes lit up as she considered the idea. That could work. If we give people the chance to speak, real, personal stories, it could help them feel seen and heard. And maybe, just maybe, it could help shift the perspective of those still skeptical. It was a simple but powerful idea, and they quickly set to work. Over the next few weeks, they organized a series of community forums throughout Millwood County. They held sessions in schools, community centers, and even at local churches, places where people felt comfortable sharing their stories. The events were meant to give people a platform, but they also allowed Callahan and Olivia to hear directly from the community about their frustrations, fears, and hopes for a more just system. The first few forums were met with mixed reactions. Some citizens were hesitant to speak, unsure if anyone in power would actually listen. But slowly, as they heard one another's stories, the walls began to come down. People began to open up about how the system had failed them, about unfair sentences, about the feeling that the deck was stacked against them from the start. The stories were difficult to hear, but they were necessary. They humanized the issue, making it clear that the justice system wasn't just a set of laws, but something that affected real lives. At the last forum, held at a small community church on the outskirts of town, a young woman stood up. She was in her 20s, with a baby in her arms, and she spoke with raw honesty. I got a speeding ticket last year. It was for a minor violation, but I couldn't afford the fine, so they tacked on fees, and before I knew it, I was facing jail time. I don't have the resources to pay. I just wanted to be able to keep my job and take care of my son. But instead, I was punished because I was poor. The room fell silent as her words hung in the air. Callahan felt a pang in his chest. This was what they had been working for. The real stories, the raw truth that exposed the flaws in the system they were trying to change. After the forum, Olivia turned to Callahan, her expression filled with determination. This is why we're doing this. This is why the system has to change. These aren't just numbers and cases. These are people, and they deserve better. Callahan nodded, his conviction strengthened. I hear you, and I'm with you every step of the way. The success of the community forums was a turning point. People began to rally behind Olivia and Callahan's efforts, and slowly, public support for reform grew. It was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, they could see a path forward, a path built on listening, understanding, and taking real action. The journey wasn't over, but they were no longer alone in it. The community was behind them, and together, they were stronger. Months had passed since the community forums, and the momentum for reform had steadily gained ground. Judge Callahan and Olivia Williams had become more than just allies. They had become the embodiment of change for Millwood County. The work they had started was evolving into a movement, one that not only challenged the justice system, but also inspired others to reimagine what fairness and accountability could look like. The push for reform had sparked a wave of new discussions across the county, with residents, local businesses, and even some law enforcement officers joining the conversation. There was a growing sense of hope among the people that the system could indeed be made more equitable, and that change was within reach. One sunny afternoon, Callahan stood in front of a packed courtroom for the first time since the judicial reforms had begun to take root. The room was filled with colleagues, community leaders, and citizens, many of whom had attended the forums and seen the transformation firsthand. Today wasn't just another case. Today, they would witness a significant milestone. In the past, Callahan would have been preparing for another standard day of rulings and legal proceedings. But today, he was about to announce a new initiative, the creation of a community oversight board that would allow citizens to review high-profile cases, especially those involving sentencing and racial disparities. It was a step toward creating a more transparent and participatory legal process, one that would hold both the judiciary and law enforcement accountable. The room quieted as Callahan stepped to the podium, his expression serious but hopeful. Behind him, Olivia sat, her presence a reminder of the work they had done together to get to this point. Callahan cleared his throat before speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. As many of you know, the work that Judge Callahan and I have undertaken over the past several months has been about more than simply reforming laws. It's been about rebuilding trust in our legal system, and trust in each other, Olivia said, her voice carrying authority and hope. She paused and turned to Callahan, a proud yet humble look in her eyes. The work we're doing here today is a testament to what can happen when we start listening to each other, when we face the challenges we've avoided for far too long, and when we make the tough decisions needed to create real change. And Judge Callahan has shown great leadership in this regard. Callahan smiled faintly as Olivia spoke, her words grounding him in the importance of the moment. But now it was his turn to speak, to announce the future they had both worked tirelessly to shape. Today, Callahan began, we are beginning the process of creating a community oversight board. This board will not just be advisory, it will hold us accountable. We'll be open to scrutiny, to feedback, and to working together with those we serve to ensure justice is applied equitably. It will be made up of residents from different walks of life, from all backgrounds. Its purpose will be to review cases and ensure that our system of justice reflects the values we hold dear: fairness, equality, and integrity. There was a ripple of murmurs through the room, some whispers of disbelief, others of excitement. The room wasn't yet sure how to react, but Callahan felt a flicker of satisfaction. He was no longer the judge who handed down rulings without question. He was now part of a system that sought to examine itself, to confront its flaws, and to improve. I want to be clear, Callahan continued, this is just one step in a long journey. It's not enough to just talk about change. We have to implement it. We have to show that we can do better, not just through words, but through actions. And with your help, with the help of the people of Millwood County, we will do just that. After his speech, Callahan was met with applause, but it wasn't just the applause of a judge addressing a courtroom. It was the applause of a community that saw this initiative not just as a procedural change, but as a declaration of a new era. The court, once seen as an intimidating, impersonal force, was now beginning to feel more accessible and more human. That evening, as Callahan and Olivia sat in a small, quiet cafe, discussing their next steps, Olivia reflected on how far they had come. We did it, Judge, she said, a soft smile on her lips. We've made it through the hardest part. Callahan, who had always seen the law as something that simply existed to be enforced, was now beginning to understand that justice was a living, breathing entity, a process that required constant questioning, examination, and evolution. I never thought I'd be here, he admitted, but I'm proud of what we've done. I'm proud of the work we've started. Yeah, Olivia agreed, her voice filled with quiet pride. But this is just the beginning. We can't stop here. There's still a lot to do. Callahan nodded. Right. It's a long road ahead, but for the first time in my career, I feel like we're on the right path. They both sat in comfortable silence, reflecting on the journey they had shared. It hadn't been easy, and there had been moments where it felt like the work would never pay off. But the seeds had been planted, and the community was beginning to see the benefits of their efforts. As they left the cafe that evening, they knew that no matter the challenges ahead, they had made a lasting impact, a true partnership that had transformed their community and, in many ways, themselves. And in that quiet moment, they both understood that justice wasn't just about the law, it was about the people, and they had made it their mission to fight for both.